But you'll notice that around 1.6 to 1.8 million years ago, at this circle here, that we have a sudden increase, a sudden expansion of brain size. And this corresponds with the species Homo erectus, okay? So, and it's not like the brain just, all parts of it grew with each other the same amount. There was a disproportionate amount of expansion in different parts of the brain. And this can tell us about behaviors, potentially, and cognition that was selected for in our hominin ancestors. So I just want to briefly go through the major lobes of the neocortex here, since I'm going to be referring to them throughout my talk here, and about their functions. So the occipital lobe is a visual processing area, and it's actually smaller than what we would expect for a brain of our size. And I'm not really going to talk about it too much more today for that reason. And the parietal lobe, which is kind of a visual, auditory, sensory integration area of the brain, is actually quite large for what we would expect for a brain of our size. The temporal lobe here, which has quite a few different functions, it's probably most well known for having Wernickes area in the left hemisphere, which is one of your classic language processing areas, and we will talk about that again today. It's also your main auditory processing area, and there's also many other functions like facial recognition and other functions that we won't get into today, but the temporal lobe also is larger than what we would expect for a brain of our size. And then we get to the frontal lobe, which has our major motor processing areas, premotor areas, and in the most frontal portion of the frontal lobe is your prefrontal cortex, and this is where you have your executive functioning. So when you think of what makes us human, generally it's kind of what's going on in the prefrontal cortex. You have your working memory, which obviously I'm going to be talking about more today, and other executive functions. Now, if we look at the frontal cortex as a whole, we actually see that it's not larger than what we'd expect for a brain of our size. But if we just look at the prefrontal cortex, it is, okay, if that makes sense. So why do we see this disproportionate expansion of different areas of the brain? There have been several different hypotheses put out there for why the brain has expanded so much in humans. These deal with climate change, environment, social hypotheses are out there. There's one hypothesis, the Machiavellian hypothesis, that says that we have big brains so that we can deceive each other, right? And then there's, of course, the opposite hypothesis, that we have big brains so we can cooperate together. So there's a lot of different ideas that are out there, and each one by itself is probably not sufficient at this point to adequately explain why our brains have expanded so much. But there is one thing that humans do that is quite unique, and that is tool making. And I'm not saying humans are the only animals that make and use tools. There are quite a few animals that do, but we are the only animal species that habitually and universally uses tools. So this is something that I think we should consider as we're considering why the brain has expanded in the human lineage. And if we look at the invention or the advent of the major stone tool industries that have occurred in the past 6 million years or so. So if we start with 3.3 million years ago, I don't know if you guys have heard of this yet, but this is the newest discovery of the oldest dated stone tool industry that we now know of, called the Lomequian tool industry. And basically what this is instead of what we generally think of for stone tool napping, where you hold one stone in your hand, you take a hammer stone and you strike a flake off, they probably weren't doing this. What they were actually doing was taking large cobbles and smashing them against another rock. And when you think about this, I mean, obviously this is a very complex behavior, but as far as cognition, how intelligent do you really need to be to do this? The jury's still out. I mean, this is an extremely new discovery, so we'll see what comes out of that soon. Around 2.6 million years ago, we have the appearance of the Oldowan tool industry, which is what I was discussing, where you do hold it in your one hand and you are hitting it with the other. But the focus here is more on the flake tools. So you want to make these thin, sharp flakes, most likely for cutting purposes. And it's not until about 1.6 to 1.8 million years ago that we see the appearance of something completely different, where the focus is no longer on the flake tools, but the core tool itself. So they were shaping this final core tool for new purposes, possibly. And this corresponds very nicely with that sudden expansion in brain size that I just discussed. And also what is interesting is that, have you guys heard of Kanzi? Maybe some of you have in your classes. So Kanzi is mostly famous because of his involvement in the studies with language, right? So he's known for using lexicograms to be able to communicate. But also, you may not know this, but he is also the first bonobo that's been taught how to make stone tools, which is pretty neat. And of course, his initial reaction to trying to make flakes was to throw the stone, which worked actually. But they eventually did convince him to do the freehand napping gesture. But no matter how much experience, how much practice Kanzi would have, there's no way that he would ever be able to make the Acheulean hand axe like we see here. And this is a cognitive difference between bonobos and humans, and Homo erectus for that matter. So the Lomequian, I'm not going to talk about too much more today because, for one, when I designed this study, I didn't know of its existence yet. So the study I'm going to discuss is just going to be testing the Oldowan and the Acheulean tool industries to see what's going on in the brain while these are being made by modern humans. So like I mentioned, the Oldowan tool industry is this expedient method to obtain sharp flakes. So far, we don't think that there's a lot of long-term planning that goes into it. It's kind of an expedient method where you see something that you need a tool for. Here's a rock, crack it open, and use that flake for the purpose at hand. Whereas the Acheulean, they were probably carrying these for long distances, and it's thought that they probably required complex imitation to learn to make, and that mental representation, which is the idea that when you're looking at the cobble, you're able to picture what that final product is going to look like just from looking at the rock, right? And some people have even suggested that proto-language may have been necessary to learn how to make Acheulean hand axes. And some people have also noted the similarities between the hierarchical processing that goes into making a hand axe and the hierarchical processing of language. So that's been thrown out there too. But what I want to note is that currently we don't have solid evidence that language evolved this early, and I'm talking like 2 million years ago, around that time. And also, we don't have any evidence so far that either of these stone tool industries requires working memory. So this term, working memory, I'm going to be using it a lot, so I feel like I should probably describe it a bit in case you're unfamiliar with it. So your working memory is basically this system of the mind that holds and processes and manipulates information for a task at hand. And so an example of this for like spatial working memory is if you're playing chess and you're looking at each of your pieces and trying to decide, well, if I move this here, then they're going to do this, what could happen? And holding all of these things in your mind before you actually make that move. All right, but by the time you finish that game, you're probably not going to remember that move you made, right? Because once that information is gone, it's gone. So spatial working memory is mostly what I'm going to be talking about today. And this takes place in the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex. And it's also distributed across a few parietal areas as well. All right, so the reason why I say there isn't any evidence so far that working memory is involved in stone tool making is because I'm not the first person to think to look at the brain during this very important activity to get at human evolution. So there has been a group led by Dietrich Stout at Emory University that has looked at the brain, not exactly during the actual act of stone tool napping because of the techniques that he used. So he used positron emission tomography, or PET, and functional magnetic resonance imaging, or fMRI. And if you know anything about these, or if you've ever had to do this, you know that you pretty much have to lay there and you can't move. They might even tape your head down, because if there's any head movement in these machines, it's going to create motion artifacts, and you're not going to get a good picture, right? So you can imagine that if you're trying to make a stone tool, it's probably not going to work too well in a PET or fMRI scanner. So what he was actually looking at was not actual flint napping in real time and how the brain is processing that. He did have people flint napping before going into the scanner in the case of PET, and for the case of fMRI, they were just looking at pictures or videos and pressing a button to make a judgment on what they were seeing. Okay, so I mean, regardless, we're getting some really interesting results from these studies, but they're not measuring brain activity during the actual act of flint napping, and that's what I want to emphasize because I did. So we'll get to that in a bit here. First of all, what they came up with is that the mode 2, and I don't think I said this before, I might sometimes be referring to Oldowan as mode 1 and Acheulean as mode 2, just so you know. So mode 2 flint napping seems to involve more anterior or frontal regions of the brain than mode 1. So here in this figure you can see this is the ventral premotor area. So like you have your main motor strip, and this is like right in front of that. That seems to be the main area that the Oldowan is taking place in. But in the Acheulean, you see these more frontal areas. So we do have some prefrontal regions being activated during the Acheulean task. And what they're trying to argue here, so just to give you some background here, you guys maybe heard of Broca's area. This is another one of these classic language areas of the brain, which is right in front of your ventral premotor area. So it would be like right in front of here. The regions that he found for the Acheulean are right around that Broca's area, although they were in the right hemisphere. And if you know anything about Broca's area, it's usually in the left hemisphere. Regardless, he still said that what this might mean is that language is actually an exaptation of motor coordination that takes place in this region. And what I mean by that, in case you're unfamiliar, because I know I was unfamiliar with that term, is that exaptation means that language basically co-opted this structure and the functions of this structure for its own purposes. Okay? So these functions were already in place for something completely different, and language kind of took over. So there were a few issues with these studies that I think need to be addressed. For one, I mentioned that they weren't actually measuring flint napping in real time. They had very small sample sizes, about 2 to 6. And this is kind of common with neuroimaging studies, but when you have a sample size this small, you might not be getting the full picture of what was really going on in the brain during this activity. And also you would think that if they're trying to make these major claims about language evolution, that that's something that they might want to control. But unfortunately, they probably didn't know they were going to find this result, so they didn't control for language in their experiment. And in an earlier study that I carried out for my master's degree, actually, I looked at how verbal instruction affects the stone tool products that you make. And what I found was actually kind of a surprising result. You would think probably that language is going to help you, right, to make stone tools. So the people in this study, they learned how to make Acheulean hand axes. And so week to week, this is what this is showing you here. I measured the flakes that they produce, because if you're making an Acheulean hand axe, it's all about thinning the piece, right, and shaping it. So you want to have long, thin flakes in order to do that. Because if you make small, chunky flakes, that's just going to take a bite out of your edge, and you're basically going to ruin your piece. So what we're actually looking at here is the ratio of size to mass of these flakes. So the larger the ratio, the longer and thinner the flake is. And if you'll notice here, the nonverbal group is above the verbal group, which is very strange, and well above the verbal group. There was a significant difference week to week, and the verbal group actually started to backtrack after the 3rd week. So it was quite an interesting result. But the main thing that I got out of this was, well, if there's differences in the stone tools, then there must be something going on in the brain. And if that's the case, then that would suggest that what Stout and his colleagues found may not be an accurate portrayal of what's going on in the brain of, say, a proto-linguistic hominin, right? Okay, so I wanted to design a study that basically looked at the brain activity during stone napping tasks in real time, which meant that the PET scanner, the fMRI, it's not going to work. Luckily, the University of Iowa has a technique called functional near-infrared spectroscopy, and for all of our sakes today, I'm going to call that NearS from now on, okay? And I'll talk a little bit more about that in a second, but basically what I want you to know is NearS allows you to flint nap while having your brain scanned, which is awesome. I also wanted to test this hypothesis for a hierarchical gradient of activation corresponding to increasing tool complexity, or in other words, do I continue to see Acheulean tool making being processed farther forward in the brain in that prefrontal cortex area rather than the old one. And I also want to explore the effects of language instruction on neural activation patterns to see if we get the same results that Stout found. So functional near-infrared spectroscopy, or NearS, like I said, how it works is it basically just shoots near-infrared light into your head, which sounds scary, right? But it's completely safe. It's like the same amount of light that you would get by going out on a sunny day. And they use it on infants, actually, so that tells you it's very safe. So near-infrared light can actually pass through human tissues. And how it works for brain imaging is that okay, let me back up. So your brain uses a lot of oxygen, right? And different parts of your brain need more oxygen if they are actually being activated, right? So the way this works is that the oxygenated hemoglobin, or the deoxygenated hemoglobin, which is the protein in your red blood cells that carries the oxygen to your brain, this absorbs the near-infrared light while the surrounding tissues do not. And so, all right, here's the NearS machine here, not too exciting, but what we do is we end up putting a cap on the person's head, and we just have a variety of little sensors that we plug into the cap. So we have sources that emit the light into the brain, and then we have detectors that detect how much light is coming back. So if there's a lot of oxygen in one part of the brain, there's not going to be a lot of light coming back, so we can measure that. And that's how we can tell which parts of the brain are becoming more activated than others. For the materials, I just throw this in for fun so people appreciate how much rock new flint knappers go through. I had to get over 2 tons of rocks from around the country to make this experiment happen. This is just 1 truckload. I had 3 truckloads. And for each of these rocks, we had to measure the mass and the volume before we even started the experiment, so this was quite an undertaking. And throughout the experiment, we collected all the debris that the subjects produced for further analysis down the line. So for the experiment, we had 31 subjects who actually got through all 3 sessions. Quite a big difference from, 4 to 6 subjects that Stout had. We have 31, just to cover our bases. They went through 7 practice sessions where they would see a video that looked usually like this. Their instructor, his head was always cut out of the frame because the verbal and the nonverbal groups watched the same video. The verbal group got the language, the nonverbal group got a muted version of the video. So we wanted to make sure that they weren't seeing any linguistic cues from lip reading. And each time they would come into a practice session, they would get a new video teaching them a new skill. And throughout their learning, they would go to neuroimaging sessions and have this cap fitted on, and they would do a variety of tasks, and these were always the same tasks. They would have a motor baseline task, which was just clicking rocks together without actually trying to make flakes. And we would then compare this to the mode 1 and mode 2 tasks where they were flint knapping to see, or more to just eliminate the general motor areas that are inevitably going to be involved in moving your hands around, right? We're more interested in what cognitively is going on during these activities. Now, I'm trying to make NearInfrared sound really great, right? But there are some limitations to it as well. For one, it can only go a few centimeters deep. That's okay for me because I'm only really interested in what's going on the neocortex. But if, say, you are looking to use a neuroimaging technique for deeper parts of the brain, NearInfrared is not for you. And also, with the system that we have, we didn't have enough sources and detectors to cover the entire brain. So what we ended up doing was we used the coordinates that Stout claimed that he found in his papers, and we designed the cap to cover the regions that he had already found in his studies. But I was also interested, even though he didn't find any evidence for working memory, I was like, just throw in those working memory areas. We'll just test it and see. I didn't really expect much to happen. So that's this area here, the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex. So just so you know, this is that cap we used. This is an example of, setting someone up for the study. And each of these are one of these regions of interest, so you can see how much area of the brain we were able to cover with this geometry. So each time a person would come in, we would map and digitize their head with this Polhemus Patriot device, and we would be able to take these coordinates and do photon migration studies. If you have questions about all the data analysis stuff afterwards, we can talk about it. But I don't want to get into this too much because it's kind of confusing. But basically, we take the raw optic signals that come from those detectors that I talked about, and we can perform group-level analyses on these. And like I said earlier, the baseline task is really our control task so that we can eliminate those motor areas. So the results I'm going to talk about are only the areas that weren't also activated in the motor baseline task. Okay, so here are some of the results. I'll explain this complicated figure in a second here. So for verbal instruction, we did find differences between the groups, whether they learned with verbal instruction or nonverbal instruction. Let's take a look at this figure. So the colors that you're seeing here, for the orange, that's your task main effect. So whenever you see an orange splotch, that's an area of the brain where there was a significant difference between mode 1 and mode 2. Okay? If that makes sense. For the green, any green splotches are where there were differences between the verbal and nonverbal groups. Okay? And the yellow is any interaction between these two. So basically, does verbal instruction interact with how you produce mode 1 or mode 2 tools? Okay? So, and the red are the regions of interest from Stout studies. Okay? Let's pay just attention to this first panel here because it's the most exciting. So this area is that right hemisphere inferior frontal gyrus area that's close to Broca's area that I talked about earlier. This is the area that he's making his big claim that language co-opted this area, right? We actually replicated his results in the verbal group. That's this here. So baseline is low, mode 1 is slightly higher, and then bam, mode 2 is really high. But we got the opposite result in the nonverbal group. So what this suggests is that language instruction does have a significant effect on how Oldowan and Acheulean tool-making behaviors are processed in the brain. And what this means is that Stout's results, unfortunately, are probably not an accurate representation of, say, an earlier hominin that doesn't have language. So we need to look at the brain more without language instruction because different neural networks are participating, whether you learned with language or without language. So in this figure, this is showing you all the unique areas that we found in our study that Stout had not previously reported. And this may be for a variety of reasons. It may be that sample size I was talking about, or it may be because of language instruction, or it could be because we were looking at flint napping in real time. The most important conclusion that we can draw from this here, and I'm going to zoom in on some of these areas since this is a very large and confusing figure, is that Acheulean tool manufacture requires the involvement of spatial working memory areas. This is new. Stout didn't find any working memory areas, remember. And we don't find this with Oldowan tool making either. This is just the Acheulean. And what's interesting is nonverbal instruction leads to even more engagement of spatial working memory areas than the verbal group does. So let's look first at the prefrontal lobe. So we see Brodmann area 46 and Brodmann area 9. These are the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, or those working memory areas that I mentioned before. This is just a close-up for you to see them. And this is only active in the Acheulean. Now if you look at other parts of the brain, we see that the superior temporal gyrus is more active for the Acheulean as well. And remember I mentioned Wernickes area and how I would bring it up again? Well, here it is. So Wernickes area, and we're actually in real Wernickes area in the left hemisphere here. This was kind of a surprise that this lit up for the Acheulean task. And what I think might be going on here is when you're making an Acheulean hand-axe, platform setup is very important. If you're not familiar with flint napping, basically when you look at the stone, the area that you're looking at that you're going to strike that takes off the flake is the platform. And you need to set up this platform in order to control the shape and the size of that flake. So as you're hitting this, you hear a lot of sounds. Some sounds are very good. It's like, just takes off a nice flake, and you know exactly that that flake is what you're looking for. But then there's a lot of like clunk, clunk, clunks. And this comes in rapid succession in varying tones. And what might be going on here is that Wernickes area is processing all of these different sounds for flint napping, which may have fine-tuned this area for future evolution of language. And like I mentioned with the nonverbal group, there were some more working memory areas involved in that group only. One of these was the inferior parietal lobule, which is one of these integration areas. It's taking auditory information, it's taking sensory, it's taking visual information, integrating that together to make sense of it. Okay, so at this point, you might be wondering, like, okay, so are these differences that we're seeing in the brain, are they just because of learning differences? Like the verbal and nonverbal group might just be learning at different stages and they're at a different skill set. So I asked this as well, but the only way to look at this is to look at the stones. So here are some hand X's actually from my previous study, just because I haven't been able to take pictures yet of what's coming out of this study. But I looked at a variety of different measures that measure skill. And what I found is that there really aren't too many differences between the verbal and nonverbal groups. So if you look at the hand axes, there's the same amount of refinement in both groups. If you look at the flakes, flake to non-flake shatter proportions, those are similar. You would expect a more skilled group to be producing more flakes that are functional than the shatter. The only difference that I found was in the nonverbal group, that they had a significantly higher ratio of flake to mass, which is exactly what I showed you earlier. So I'm replicating my same results from my master's. But the overall point I want to get at here is that overall they are pretty similar in their skill level by this point. So I don't think that's what's really going on in the brain here. Okay, so hand axes were around for over 1 million years. And they spread throughout Africa and Eurasia. So it's likely that they were probably very important, right? They were most likely used for procuring food resources, and they probably worked, and so why change what already works? And you have some sites like Alorgesailie in Africa that have thousands and thousands of hand axes that have just been dropped there. So this suggests that a lot of individuals probably knew how to do this, and it was probably just a day-to-day thing that they did. So if this is such an important skill for learning how to get the food resources that you need, then working memory is probably going to be selected for, right? If you need working memory to learn how to make a hand axe, if you have a better working memory, you might be able to make a better hand axe, which means more food resources, more diverse food resources. And if you can make a better hand axe and you have all of these food resources, you're probably going to be more reproductively successful. And if you're more reproductively successful, then you're probably going to have offspring that are going to end up being more reproductively successful because you can teach them this skill, and they probably also have a higher working memory capacity. So, does working memory actually correlate with brain size? Because there's been this argument that language could have led to larger brain size, right? So does working memory and tool use. So these are just some examples of studies that have found that tool use and working memory positively correlate with larger brain size, okay? So this first study here, they looked at over 100 primate species, basically, to see if they make stone tool, or sorry, not stone tools, if they use tools. And they also looked at brain size, and they found that if a primate species makes tools, they're more likely to have a larger brain than a species that doesn't make tools, okay? This other study here was able to correlate working memory to gray and white matter volumes of the brain. So gray matter is your neurons or your brain cells, and white matter is the connections between those brain cells. So if you have a higher working memory capacity, it's more likely that you're going to have a larger volume of gray and white matter, okay? And they actually found that language did not correlate well with larger brain volume. And there was a study this year as well that came out where they tracked people who were learning how to flint knap over a year's time, and they found that they also had larger white matter volumes that developed over time. So that's more of a plastic effect over one's lifetime. But so what could be going on here is that selection for larger working memory capacities may have been this driving force behind the expansion of the neocortex and the different parts of the neocortex that I mentioned earlier in early Homo. And I think that's it. Yeah, so I couldn't have done this without my team. This was a lot of work. And so gotta thank the people who made it happen, and all my funding. That's good too. And the students who assisted me. Thank you. Questions? Yeah.
Yeah. So for a while now, people have been arguing that social behaviors were a driving force behind increasing brain size. And I wasn't familiar with that NearInfrared technique. That's a really fascinating methodology. Have you thought of, or has anyone else thought of, replicating your experiments, but not with tool manufacture, but with people engaged in social interactions in which they would have to manipulate one another? And do you think that would have any value?
I think it would have value. At this point, I am the only person that I know of who has even thought to use NearInfrared for anthropological questions. So nobody that I know of has looked into anything like that yet. And I don't think that these results are necessarily at odds with the social cooperation hypotheses, because, I mean, in order to learn this, you have to socially cooperate. Somebody has to teach this to you, right? But yeah, no, I think it would be a valuable addition.
That's your postdoc.
Yeah. Somebody gives me money. Other questions? Yes.
Were there any differences between individuals and how well the system worked on them?
You know, I haven't looked at individual differences in the results, but I don't think that's what you're asking. Are you asking like
people with maybe thicker skulls?
Yeah.
Bigger people versus smaller people?
Yeah, so this was actually another limitation of this technique that I didn't mention. And this was just kind of discovered along the way, because when I put out the call for people to come participate, I didn't think to only say blonde people come participate. It's terrible, because because of the dark pigment in the hair, it absorbs the light, and so the light doesn't reach the brain. And so I had to tell a lot of people that they couldn't be a part of the study, unfortunately, because they had dark hair. So, and also, so I thought, I'll get bald people, right? So I brought in several bald guys, but I think baldness is linked with testosterone, and testosterone is linked with like larger bone size, I think. So they had really thick skulls, and I couldn't get the light through their thick skulls. So that didn't work either. So it turned out that like the absolute best person was a petite female with like light blonde or light red hair. Yeah. Yeah.
You mentioned that you thought that maybe hearing the sound striking the stone might have had something to do with their skill level, maybe. Have you thought about doing it again, but maybe putting earplugs in one group so they can't hear the stone?
I had not thought of that, no. I was thinking of, well, the nice thing about NearS is you can look at what's going on in the brain within milliseconds, right? So I was thinking of going back and like looking at when they actually make a flake versus when they just hear the clunk, and seeing if there's anything different going on specifically in that area for, to try to distinguish those sounds.
Yeah.
Wonderful talk.
Thank you.
Fascinating. And I also hadn't heard of the NearS.
I hadn't either.
It's really exciting. You're doing great stuff. Did I understand right that in the different stone-making techniques you found a difference in lateralization?
Stout did, because he found like bilateral activation for the Oldowan, but only right hemisphere activation with the Acheulean. I did not. There was pretty much bilateral activation for both techniques.
Including in the Wernickes area?
Yes.
I'm not as familiar with these stone techniques as stone making techniques as I should be. If I understand the older one, you use you kind of hit the.
That's the Lumequian, which I didn't test because I didn't know that it existed yet. The Oldowan and Acheulean are very similar, that you hold one in the hand and you hit it. It's just that the Acheulean is requiring more shaping and control over what those flakes are going to do.
Did the earlier study, not yours, find actually look at subcortical?
They had fMRI, so they were able to look at deeper structures. They found areas of activation in the cerebellum mainly, which isn't too surprising. They didn't really find too many other deep areas of the brain that were involved, but they may just have not reported them because it's not exciting.
Oh, it is. I'm sorry. I'm not taking too much time.
No, go ahead.
You know, Lieberman's work on these neural loops between the thalamus and the frontal cortex. His idea is that language evolved out of earlier things having to do with sequencing. He was talking about walking, and there are many other factors as well. And the same thing with the people with the mirror neurons. So I'm interested in this, any evidence of this loop, not necessarily relating language to it, but the idea of sequential action. And the Wernickes area, some people, and people don't talk about this anymore, it was like 50, 60 years ago. People like Jacobson were relating to the idea of paradigmatic and syntagmatic. Broca's, the frontal cortex, was more things having to do with sequencing and hierarchy, and Wernickes area with the paradigmatic, the things that would go in the slots provided by the syntax. And so I'm really interested in why was Wernickes area activated?
Yeah, I mean, I wasn't really expecting to find activation there, so.
And that was in just in the one, the later technique.
Just in what?
That wasn't in both tool making techniques, was it the old one?
It was
the old one.
The Acheulean tool industry activated that area more so than the older one.
Yeah, and so that's why I was asking about the difference. I thought, what could this be?
Yeah.
Could it be handedness? And the idea of hearing the right clink is a little suspicious because music also involves would be Wernickes area, but in the right hemisphere. And
Yeah, I'm pretty sure it was bilateral
well,
activation.
that wouldn't be a contradiction. The bilateral thing appears to be stronger in illiterate people anyway. Oh, anyway, I'm sorry.
Yeah.
Was handedness a factor?
That was controlled for. Everybody was right-handed. Because this can affect like where Broca's area of the brain is located in. So yeah, we controlled for that. Yeah.
Have you spoken with Stout?
Very briefly. I mean, he's well aware of my work because he had to review all my grant proposals. But yeah, he's very interested in hearing what I come out with. But these things are also somewhat territorial, so we'll see how it goes.
All right. Well, thank you very much, Shelby.
Thank you for having me.